Imagine a world in which writing the discussion of your research paper was simple because you knew exactly what information to include, where to include it, and how to put it together to convince even the highest impact journals of the importance of publishing your work. Well, that world may be waiting for you at the other end of this video. Hi, I'm Casey, and this is Butler Scientific Communications. I'm going to give you over a decade's worth of knowledge from academia in both research science and as a professional editor, where I've helped get hundreds of papers across fields published in even the highest level journals. If you are ready to simplify your discussion writing, then stick with me and let's get started. The discussion section of your research paper is going to tell your reader what your results mean and how they fit in the context of your field. Stated more specifically for my scientists out there, the discussion section is where you critically analyze and interpret the results of your scientific study and explain how they affect the field. So let's start with a fun little story that's going to explain a bit about why we want a discussion section, how to think about our discussion section, and the different parts of a discussion section. So I took this story from an article called Thick Books and Thin Films by Adam Rubin, published in Science. If you want a laugh out loud hilarious take on the representation of science in movies, I highly suggest giving this a read. Now, on to this story. Let's say you're doing an experiment with 5 mice and you expect these mice to turn either yellow or blue. So you walk into the lab expecting to see either 5 yellow mice, which will point to one explanation, or 5 blue mice, which will point to another. Has that ever happened? In the history of science, I have never seen something work that straightforwardly. Instead, what might happen is you walk into the lab and you do see 1 yellow mouse, and then you see 1 green mouse, and 1 striped mouse, and 1 plaid mouse, but he's dead, and then 1 mouse who has somehow sewn himself a little blue jacket, though he doesn't wear it all the time. Okay, maybe a little silly, but this shows why we need a discussion section, because now it is our job to take these results and talk about or discuss or interpret what they may mean for our reader. For instance, let's talk about the green mouse, the striped mouse, and that dead plaid mouse. Because you might say the green, striped, and plaid mice displayed intermixing of the yellow and blue genes, with both activating at the same time but in different patterns. Now, let's talk about this sentence. The first part of this sentence where we talk about the results that we saw, restating for the reader the green, striped, and plaid mouse, reorienting them back at a key result of our paper. This we're going to call the summary of results. This is where we remind the reader of key results that we saw in the main body of the paper. So this is our first key part of information you would include in a discussion section. Now, let's look at the second half of this sentence where we talk about this intermixing between the genes. Here, this is not necessarily a direct output of our experiment, so we're not summarizing the result. Here, we are critically analyzing what that result means. So we are taking the direct output of the experiment and we are translating it for our reader into language that they might understand. Your reader is not an expert in your field and they may not know what the direct output of an experiment means, so we want to make sure we tell them what we think the direct output of that experiment means. This is going to be the critical analysis of your results. With this part of your discussion, we want to make sure we highlight any key relationships, trends, and limitations of our work. Moving on, we can continue talking about these mice, and we might say something like this. Supporting our results, this intermixing was also found in several other studies in both mice and rabbits. Additionally, as plaid pattern mice have not yet been generated with this technique, we show that it is possible, though appears to be lethal, which may explain why this has not yet been seen. Now, let's dissect these new few sentences, and let's go back to that first one where we talk about something that supports our findings. Notice here we also include a reference at the end of this sentence. This is going to make up the third key part of our discussion section, where we start to bring in references from the field and we start to relate the work we saw in this paper out to previously published work. We're going to use this part of our discussion to show how our work relates to the field, to reference all related work, and to show any studies that either support or conflict with our data. Now, move on to the next sentence where we talk about something that has not yet been seen in the field, that these plaid pattern mice have not yet been generated in the field. This is a research gap that existed in the field before our study existed and helps highlight for the reader that edge of current knowledge so they can see where the edge of the field was before you started this work. This will help highlight the importance of your work and is going to make up the fourth key part of our discussion section. Now, let's talk about two more key parts of discussion section, and we're going to do that using that mouse who has sewn himself a little blue jacket. We might talk about this mouse using a sentence like, though no mice have been yet sewn to show little blue jackets, recent work by et al. Presented a newly discovered Martha Stewart gene in zebrafish that caused the zebrafish to bake their researcher cookies. We hypothesize the existence of a similar yet undiscovered gene in mice. Future studies should scan the mouse genome for sequence similarities. So let's dissect what we've written here. First, we started this with a reference to a gap in the field or that edge of current knowledge that no mice have yet been shown to do this. And then we bring in references from the field that help sort of point us in a direction of why this may be or what might explain what we saw here. And we do this by referencing that paper in zebrafish and that Martha Stewart gene. Then we speculate on what this may mean. Notice that we do that by speculating that this Martha Stewart gene found in zebrafish may have a homologous gene in mice. So this is going to be where we, part number 5, speculate beyond the edge of current knowledge that existed when we started this research project. Here, you can also speculate on any new hypotheses that could be generated because of your work, any new research questions that may come up, any changes you're proposing to best practices in the field, or generally any sort of speculation about what that new edge of current knowledge might be now that your research exists. Finally, notice the last line here when we talk about this blue mouse, where we say that future studies should scan the mouse genome looking for this equivalent gene. This is going to be the 6th key part of a discussion section where we give future directions for where this research may go. So let's review these 6 key parts of a discussion section with a little diagram showing maybe how they all fit together. So let's imagine that the work that you did in this study is this gray dot here. This is going to include your summary of your results as well as the critical analysis of those results where you interpret them for your reader. But the problem is, without any context, the reader has no idea how big of a role your paper plays in your field or how your work connects to or fits into your field. So it is our job to show our reader where our little circle of work fits into the greater circle of our field. What does your work touch on in that field? And then to convey the importance of our work, we also need to show how our circle touches on the edge of the field or that edge of current knowledge, because this is where we show how we are moving that field out, how we're expanding the field, and the importance of our work. How is that edge of current knowledge different now that our work exists? And then finally, our field and what we know about our field is only really one small piece of what's actually out there. So we're going to start speculating about what might be beyond our field, what we might be shedding a little bit of light onto now that our work exists. And then finally, we're going to give the reader a few ideas of how we may move the field from where it is now to where it could possibly be in the future, providing the reader with some future directions, part number 6, for where this work may go. Now, you may notice that every time I refer to each of these different parts of a discussion section, they are colored. That is for a reason. I will get to it in one moment. Let's first talk about our research paper and how our discussion section fits in, and then I'll show you exactly what those colors mean. We want to think of our research paper like this hourglass shape, where the top of the hourglass represents the beginning of our research paper and the bottom represents the end of our research paper. And then the shape of this hourglass from left to right represents the scope of the paper, or how broadly accessible the information is at each part of the research paper, moving from a very broad scope that is accessible to a very broad and wide audience down into a narrow scope that is mostly accessible to people in your field. And so with this shape, we can see that our introduction starts at a broad scope, funnels the reader down into our research, which is the narrowest scope of the paper, and then our discussion. So we can see that the scope in our discussion starts at the narrowest point. It starts from a very field-specific focus and slowly expands outwards to the broadest possible scope we reach in our paper, which is going to be the part that is the most broadly accessible to any audience of our research paper. The discussion section is going to be broken up into 3 distinct patterns of paragraph. The first one we're going to talk about is the introduction to the discussion. This paragraph is going to sum up the key results of the paper and relate them to the edge of current knowledge in the field. So this is going to show the reader the key parts of your paper and how they changed or modified the field that you present in the beginning of your research paper. Then we're going to move on to the second type of paragraph, which I call the middle discussion paragraphs. The average discussion section has 2 to 6 of these types of paragraphs, which start at a key result or key idea generated by your paper and walk the reader through any key parts of the discussion section that apply specifically to that result. And our final paragraph is going to be the conclusion. This is going to be one very forward-thinking paragraph that highlights the impact that your work has had and shows why your work is important and deserves to be published. So now that we've talked a little bit about scope and what that means for your research paper, let's go back and look at the 6 key parts of a discussion. Notice that these are arranged from the narrowest scope at the beginning, or the parts that would be only the most understandable to experts in your field, through to the broadest scope parts at the end, or the parts that should be the most accessible to any reader, regardless of their field. So when I start giving you discussion examples here in a moment, note that you'll be able to follow the flow of the scope throughout these examples by following the flow of these colors, with the lightest shade of the color indicating narrowest scope and the darkest shade of the color indicating broadest scope. Now let's look at an example discussion. This one here was published in the journal Nature. Notice here first that with these 4 paragraphs, this discussion follows exactly the outline that I have already given you, with the first paragraph being that intro to the discussion, the next 2 being middle paragraphs, and the final one being a forward-thinking conclusion. Let's focus in first on this first paragraph, the intro to the discussion. Notice here that this paragraph includes only 2 colors or 2 key parts. The first one is a summary of key results, and the second part is the gap in the field. And it should make sense that these are the 2 parts that we see here at the beginning of our discussion section, because this part should be the narrowest in scope. So it should have the greatest concentration of summary of key results, which it does. And as this part of the discussion immediately follows the results section, this is the best place to sum up all the key results. We don't want that narrow scope at the end. We want it here at the beginning. And then with this paragraph, notice what we're doing with the inclusion of these 2 parts as well. So we are summing up all of the key results, key ideas generated from our paper, which is perfect. But we don't stop there. We relate those to the gap in the field or the edge of current knowledge that existed when we started this work. And in this way, we use this first paragraph to not just give a summary, but to show the reader directly and immediately at the start of our discussion exactly how our work affected the field that existed before we did this project. Now, let's talk about writing this first paragraph. So notice here, this particular paragraph is written such that there are short snippets summarizing a key result, and then they're followed by a description of how that result affected that edge of current knowledge. So this discussion includes a lot of key results attached to a lot of smaller gaps in the field. This is a great way to write this first paragraph, especially if there are a lot of small gaps that your paper addressed. But this is not the only way you have to write this paragraph. Often, your paper addressed one main research gap, and you have several results that build up to that. In this case, you would write a paragraph that looks more like this example here, where there is a lot more summary of key results, and all of those key results are related to one main gap in the field that existed at the start of this research project. And here, do not overthink this. Do what works for you in your paper and your project. Now, before we get to those middle paragraphs, let's jump ahead quickly to the conclusion of this discussion. Notice here again how this is not in any way a summary of results. And that is because, remember from our hourglass shape, this part should be the broadest in scope, which means it should absolutely not be a summary. Instead, it should be very forward-thinking, and it should consist of those darkest colors in our different parts of discussion. Let's talk about why this makes sense. This is the final paragraph of your research paper. By this point, you want your reader to be getting excited about the implications of this work. What does this work mean? Why does it matter? Why are we publishing this? And if we just have a summary, that's not going to do anything for our reader. Instead, your final paragraph of your discussion, your conclusion, is forward thinking, those darkest three colors, or those last three key parts of a discussion to show the implications of your work and why your work matters. Now, let's move back to those middle paragraphs. This example here shows 3 middle paragraphs taken from the discussion section of a different research paper, and we're going to walk through how to set up these paragraphs. The first thing that I want you to notice here is every single one of these paragraphs starts with one of the first 2 colors or the first 2 parts of our discussion section. So either summary of results or critical analysis of those results. Notice what it does not start with, and that is the field. It is very common in the discussion section to start these paragraphs with a little bit of the field, setting up why you're going to talk about the next thing that you talked about. But this discussion and this paper is the origin story of your work. The spotlight here in this paper is on your work and the results that you generated. So you can see that every single one of these paragraphs starts with reminding the reader of a key result of the paper and then proceeding to critically analyze it by providing the reader with some information that lets them know what that result means and what that result is telling you. So next we are going to start relating our results out to the field. Here we first want to start thinking about any literature, any previous work that supports our findings or that helps show how our work fits into what is already out there and what already exists. Here though, I want to remind you to not forget to include work that contradicts your results. What are the differences between your study and those contradictory studies? Why do you think you are seeing different results? What is changed between those 2 studies? Explore that a little bit and even feel free to provide your opinion on which one you think might be more correct. From the field, we're going to start expanding out. We're going to speculate on what new knowledge this work has generated. What can now be built or made or done or calculated because our research exists? What are new hypotheses or new research questions that can be generated from our research? How do we think that edge of current knowledge has maybe changed or moved or shifted? Are you proposing any changes to best practices in your field? So from the speculation, now we want to provide some future directions. How might we address these new hypotheses or research questions that we speculated on? What else might this work lead to? Where might it go next? Here is also where we can talk about any future experiments to address any limitations that we brought up in the critical analysis portion. Do note here, you may potentially have limitations of your study spread out over a couple different paragraphs. I prefer this format to the one in which you have a separate paragraph of limitations, especially because that paragraph is usually located towards the end of the discussion. By including the limitations in these different middle paragraphs of the discussion, we're helping to keep the reader excited about our work. Now, let's talk about some different types of middle paragraphs you might use in your discussion, because you're not going to have the same types of information to say about every key result or key idea that's generated in your study. You're going to want to use different mixes of these key parts to convey the ideas or the points that you need to convey in each paragraph. So let's check out this first example here. Notice this paragraph is a good mix between the main parts of the discussion section, especially those middle parts of the critical analysis, relating your results to the field and speculating about what these results may mean. Here you can also feel free to add any future directions that apply to the work you're presenting in this paragraph. This well-balanced paragraph is a perfect starting point for your discussion. And when in doubt, you can always refer to a paragraph like this, where you can mainly just try to walk through the key parts of a discussion and brainstorm what might fit with this key idea or key result that you're presenting here. Now, you may also need to have a paragraph that looks a little bit more like this example here. Notice that this paragraph here is fairly heavy on the critical analysis. Paragraphs like these are used to justify your interpretation of your result, and they are especially useful for presenting a key result or idea that is maybe unexpected or surprising or potentially contradictory to existing information, because now you have the space to expand on that analysis and make sure that your reader is on board with your interpretation of your result before you start going a little bit more in depth into maybe why this is surprising or unusual. Now, you may also need to have paragraphs that look like this example here. Notice that this one is skewed towards references to the field as well as to that edge of current knowledge. Paragraphs like these are used to provide literature support for your findings. They help show your work's place in the field or how it fits into the field. You may also have paragraphs that look like this example here. Notice that this one is skewed highly towards speculation, though still has quite a bit of references to the literature in there. Paragraphs like these are great for explaining new hypotheses or new proposed research questions, giving you the space to speculate as well as to tie in a little bit of literature to give them some support. These are also a great place to explain contradictory results, where you can explain what else has been shown in the literature and then speculate on what the differences might be between your findings and those previously published literature findings. Finally, you might have paragraphs that look like this example here. Notice that this one is mainly just speculation. Paragraphs like these are a great place for discussing the impact or the implications of your work. What has your work changed or modified about the field? And so that is the structure of your discussion section. To quickly recap, it's going to start with that introduction to the discussion, which is going to be one paragraph summarizing the key results or findings of your work and relating them to the edge of current knowledge that existed when you conducted this study. In other words, how did your work directly affect that edge of current knowledge? Then, in the middle of your discussion, you are going to find the 2 to 6, usually, key ideas or results that you want to discuss in more depth with your reader, and you are going to dedicate usually 1 or 2 paragraphs to each one of those points, walking the reader through any key parts that apply and making sure that you skew towards the parts that you need to make the point that you are trying to make in that paragraph. Finally, we're going to finish our discussion with that one very forward-thinking paragraph that shows why this work matters, why this work deserves to be published. And there you have it, exactly what you need to write, where you need to write it, and how you need to organize it to convey the impact and importance of your work in your discussion section. So now, hopefully you are ready to get started on your own discussion section. And once you have drafted that discussion, you're going to want to check back for our next video that's going to walk you through the 7 biggest mistakes I see in discussion sections. Go write a powerful discussion, get that paper published, and happy writing.